Good afternoon, or good morning, as appropriate. See some folks are still filing in, but I would like to get this started. Hello, I'm Olga Oliker. I direct the Europe and Central Asia program at the International Crisis Group. The International Crisis Group is a non-governmental research and advocacy organization that is dedicated to leveraging ground truth and pragmatism to prevent and mitigate the effects of deadly conflict globally. Today, we will be talking about the war in Ukraine. As the second year of full-scale war in Ukraine comes to a close, Ukraine is emerging from a disappointing counteroffensive short of weapons and personnel, and Russian troops are advancing, albeit still slowly and as always painfully. The center of gravity for this war these last few months, however, has seemed less the bloody battlefield and more Washington, D.C., where a small group of Republicans in the House of Representatives have kept the United States from living up to its promise to keep Ukraine supplied with military assistance. Here in Europe, while countries such as the United Kingdom, France, and Germany are signing agreements with Ukraine and promising assistance, if not in perpetuity, then certainly for a good long time, their ability to deliver is put into question by the record to date. Having promised that Ukraine would get 1 million shells from EU states by March 2024, it is now looking like Ukraine will only get about half that number. Meanwhile, in Russia, Vladimir Putin is gearing up to be re-elected president in just about 1 month, and his most prominent opponent, the anti-corruption and opposition activist Alexei Navalny, is, as of today, reported to have died in prison, where he has been held since shortly after he returned to Russia following treatment in Germany for a poisoning attempt a few years back. To talk through what we're seeing and what it might mean, I am really pleased to welcome some of Crisis Group's brightest minds on these topics. With us, we have Alissa de Carbonnel, the Deputy Director of the Europe and Central Asia Program, who has a wealth of experience in Russia and in Ukraine. Sarah Harrison, a senior analyst in our US program, who has been looking at dynamics in Washington and with aid. Simon Schlegel, our senior analyst for Ukraine, who is joining us from Ukraine, where he lives, and he will talk to us about what's going on in Kyiv. And Oleg Ignatov, our senior analyst for Russia, based here in Brussels with me, who is keeping in touch and trying to keep his finger on the pulse of events in that country. This is going to be a moderated discussion between the panelists for 30, 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. So guests, we're really glad to have you here. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please don't forget to tell us your name and your affiliation. This call is being recorded and live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel, so just be aware of that. And with that, I would like to just go ahead and dive in. I want to start with Simon. Simon, I want to ask you, what is the mood in Kyiv and around Ukraine these days?
I would say the mood is very gloomy at the moment. It's perhaps the most precarious situation for Ukraine since the early phase of the invasion in winter 2022. Everything feels on hold. There's a palpable sense of uncertainty. And in contrast to 2022, it's now not this one big thing that everybody anticipates to happen, but it's multiple crises stacked on top of each other. And the first one, you've already mentioned it, is the shortage of ammunition that Ukraine is feeling the sting of right now. Even with the most optimistic calculations, which would mean that the US has to actually deliver, Ukraine would get only between half and 3/4 of the ammunition required for localized fire superiority in 2024. And there are spots along the front lines where this can be very badly felt at the moment, most of all the Donetsk city of Avdiivka, where the last few days have seen a very bad dynamic for the Ukrainians, and where the Ukrainians do not have enough ammunition to fire back and will probably be on the retreat quite soon. That is one big problem. Another one is the fear of a lack of air defense interceptors if Western aid is not coming forward. In Kyiv, we've gotten quite used to good shoot-down rates during Russian air raids in big attacks. The Ukrainians can still take down about 70% of all missiles and drones that Russia sends here. In smaller attacks, it's up to 90%. So people in Kyiv and other population centers have started to feel quite safe even during big rocket attacks, the last of which just happened an hour ago. If that deteriorates, then this is going to be a much higher sense of insecurity for the civilian population again, but also difficulties for the Ukrainians to supply their troops because supply lines will come under attacks again, and for domestic arms production, which as Western aid starts to diminish, is the best answer the Ukrainians have. So all of that is going to put more pressure on the soldiers on the front line, and they are exhausted. Many have been serving for 2 years straight, haven't been rotating quick enough. Their average age is 43 years. So it's not a fresh force anymore. And there's no way to replenish that force without taking very unpopular measures. The people who are not fighting now have mostly chosen to do so, and have mostly chosen to stay off the state's radar. And to get to them, the state will have to reform the way it mobilizes people, and will have to go to really unpopular measures that are quite an intrusion in people's civic rights and private lives. All of that is sort of stacking up together. And but it also, I mean, the slowness with which the government has taken measures to unpopular measures, it also shows that there's still checks and balances in place, which is something that is a comparable disadvantage towards Russia. Russia can mobilize much more harsh measures than Ukraine can. So it still also feels that there is a space for parliament, for the media, for civil society to criticize, and that is when I say the mood is again as gloomy as in 2022. I also mean that there's still a really strong sense of defiance and resistance, and there's still a core consensus that giving up territory or giving up the perspective of joining the European Union and NATO eventually is not a public discussion still at the moment. So in the face of aggression, there's still a big spirit of defiance here, but the resources to put that defiance into practice are really dwindling now.
So can I ask a quick follow-up question? I mean, you talked about Ukrainian forces being pushed back. If Ukraine is to shift its approach to a defensive approach, there's actually a logic to falling back to easier to defend positions from the positions that were taken at the tail end of the counteroffensive that didn't get as far. To what extent can we tell, right, whether they're being forced back, when they're making choices? A lot of the reporting I'm hearing does sound like they're being forced back, but one makes a certain amount of one makes certain decisions about when and how to retreat. Is that what we're seeing, or is it difficult to tell?
It's difficult to tell. I would say one indicator of how planned that is how orderly the retreat actually happens. In Avdiivka, I had the impression that over the last couple of days, the dynamics have changed very quickly, and that the Ukrainians really felt that they needed to react in order not to be encircled. And therefore, the sense that I'm getting here is that this is sort of an intermediate between planning and orderly retreat. But it's very likely that we're going to see more of these more or less orderly retreats over the next couple of months in the places where the Russians concentrate their firepower.
Thanks. So, Oleg, I mean, the news in Russia, I think, is at least my Russian source feeds are preoccupied with the death of Alexei Navalny. But overall, how would you say the mood in the Kremlin has been in recent weeks? Are they popping the champagne corks? What's going on?
So from our contexts, we have been seeing how the mood in Russia has changed by the beginning of 2024 compared to the beginning and even the summer of 2023. It's true that they are now extremely confident. They believe that Russia is on track to achieve its goals. Some even say that there has been a fundamental turning point in this war in Russia's favor, and that Ukraine will no longer be able to accumulate enough resources to conduct large offensive operation and liberate its territories in the future. They are not focused on the problems with American assistance. They believe that Russian army has adapted to the level of support Ukraine had in 2023. And they think that if Ukraine got US support on the same level, it won't change the overall picture. There is also a growing understanding that Ukraine will have increasing mobilization problems, and it will no longer be able to mobilize as many soldiers as it did in 2022. And that advantage, Russia's advantage in manpower, not only ammunition, could be the deciding factor in the war. They also believe that Russia's airstrike campaign is becoming increasingly effective, and that this factor will prevent Ukraine from deploying large military production on its territory. And overall, they're convinced that Zelensky's strategy of liberating territories is not working, and that the strategy of just holding the line without liberating Ukraine's land will also lead to more problems with Western support to Ukraine.
Thank you. So with that pretty gloomy assessment, Sarah, how are people in Washington responding to this? Are they too preoccupied with their own issues to pay attention? Are they thinking about how to turn things around? Is there a plan B?
Yeah, well, if you talk to the Biden administration, the money has run out. There is no more assistance, and the president and his cabinet members have insisted that Congress has to act. And so what we've seen over the last several months is, first, Biden sent his proposal for what's called supplemental emergency funding. It's separate from the regular appropriations that the government does. And this is the kind of funding that's been provided over the last 2 years to Ukraine. And so the president sent a proposal to Congress that included money for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan. He even tried to make it very bipartisan by putting border security funding in there, because Republicans insisted that they wouldn't pass the supplemental funding bill without border security funding. And so over the last few months, senators on both sides of the aisle hashed out a deal, and they put this forward in early February, earlier this month. But the House leader, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, made it very clear that if that bill came to the House, it would be dead on arrival. This was repeated over and over for days, that this bill would be dead on arrival. And so Senator Schumer struck the border security provisions of that bill because Mike Johnson, the Speaker, had said there were too many loopholes in it and it wasn't sufficient. And so Senator Schumer put it up for a vote, and it passed with wide margins, 70 to 29, 70 senators voting in favor. The problem is that President Trump, former President Trump, who's running for president again against President Biden, opposes a border deal because he thinks it would actually benefit Biden in an election year, and so encouraged senators to not vote for it, and encouraged members of the House to not vote for it. But he also opposes funding to Ukraine, and has proposed things like sending loans instead of granted assistance to Ukraine, even in this time of great need. And so with this stranglehold of the president on lawmakers, and this very weird arrangement in the House where the Speaker of the House can be taken down by one person, everyone we speak to on the Hill says it's very dysfunctional. And one staffer in particular said it's more dysfunctional than he's ever seen in 20 years. And so I think that the Biden administration is at a loss for what to do next, right? Except for continuing to encourage Congress to act, because they can't do anything else without Congress acting. Minimal things they can provide to Ukraine, but they really need Congress to pass a supplemental funding bill. Congress just went on recess and they won't return until the end of February. And at that time, they have to address the looming government shutdown, because the government continues to be funded by what's called a continuing resolution. And that resolution, the last continuing resolution that was passed, is partially up on March 1st, and then the government would fully shut down on March 8th. And so lawmakers have to turn to that work, and they can't focus on the supplemental. And House Speaker Mike Johnson has said that the supplemental will not be the priority when they come back from recess, but working towards funding the government. And so all eyes are on Washington, all eyes are on Congress to do something. We need them to, the president needs them to act, Ukraine needs them to act before more assistance can be provided at the same levels that have been provided over the last 2 years. That's a very bleak picture, but it's basically where we are.
Sarah, can you talk a little bit about what's already in the pipeline that doesn't require a supplemental? I mean, stuff is still moving, but at what point does it stop moving?
Yeah, sure. The supplemental funding that's been provided to Ukraine over the last couple of years has mostly come in two buckets. One is a presidential drawdown authority, and that has allowed the president to basically take from DoD stocks and just send to Ukraine, which is helpful, right? Because you can, the equipment's already there, the ammunition's already there, and they can move it. The president has been able to spend almost $24 billion in the last 2 years on that, when that authority is typically every year just $100 million. So he's been able to use that and use that quickly. That's all gone except for about $4 billion. The problem is there's no money to replenish DoD stocks, and DoD is at its is not going to take further risk of continuing to dip into stocks without Congress acting to make sure there's more money available to purchase stocks to put them back if they're being sent to Ukraine. And then the other bucket of funding over the last 2 years is called the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI. And this is more of, it authorizes the Secretary of Defense to send security assistance to Ukraine. And it's more of a procurement process, which takes a while, right? Because the government has to spend money on defense contracts, and then the defense contractors have to build the equipment, and that takes time. It can take years. And so there's some equipment that will still continue to go to Ukraine under these defense contracts through USAI over the next couple of years, but it will be very slow going. So it's not like what's left in the pipeline, what's being transferred, or what's being procured is enough. The money has been spent, and the administration keeps repeating over and over, there is no magic pot of money, and we really need Congress to do more. And so while there's a little flexibility there, there's not much. And so that's where things stand on the assistance piece.
Thanks so much. So, Alissa, I want to bring you in. If the Americans are letting the ball not just drop, but sort of roll away, can the Europeans step in? Zelensky has been talking to European backers. He's been signing security assistance agreements with France, with Germany, previously with the UK. Is that going to make the difference?
Yeah, so I mean, as we've heard from everybody so far, there's much that has been made about how to describe the state of the battlefield right now. You know, with Zelensky's general saying that it was a stalemate, and a lot being made over that. I mean, the fact of the matter is it's still dynamic, and neither side is spent. And so what you're looking at in 2024 is this race to rearm and reconstitute. And to your question of who can do that, I think the brief and first answer is only the US can do the kind of military assistance that Ukraine has been getting fast. As Sarah described, take it from their stocks, send it on, and that kind of quick drawdown. So the US has ramped up production, even though people are critical that they are still behind on ramping up production to what is needed. The EU is even further behind in terms of lagging on investments in ramping up defense production. I think you see this in the rhetoric from European leaders now, right? There's a certain sense of alarm. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Washington. He said in a press conference that the United States is indispensable. You heard from Macron a couple of weeks ago that Ukraine losing will be the end of European security. So you see European leaders, from the head of NATO to others, articulating, first of all, imagining a picture of Ukraine losing, which we haven't heard since the first days after Russia's full-scale invasion, to also, really calling for more to be done. But it's not that easy. After years of neglect or underfunding, depending on how you look at it, of the defense industrial complex in Europe, there's supply chain issues from explosives and other things. There are issues with the blunting effect of inflation. At the moment, there's disagreements within Europe over procurement and certain amount of nationalism over keeping production in certain countries, or how all of this gets done. And so, as you pointed out, Olga, Europe is falling short even on just ammunition of the basic sort of 150-55 artillery shells that Ukraine needs on the front lines. And so, I heard strikingly from one UK military analyst, Jack Walkman at RUSI, that he's having the same conversations now with people that he had 18 months ago. So, you can't do anything to go back in time, but whether there will be that sense of urgency to really make the decisions that will make the difference on the front lines between Ukraine starting to lose, perhaps in the year ahead, or having the kind of collective might and support of the West behind it to keep supplies coming, that's still a question mark.
Thanks. Oleg, so in Moscow, one of the things we often hear, a lot of the speculation is that if you're Russia, you should wait for the US presidential election this coming November. And then, if Donald Trump wins, you'll be in one situation. If Joe Biden wins, you'll be in a different one. Moscow should be waiting for this. But Moscow has its own election in March, and the situation is pretty dynamic. So the logic of waiting until November seems to make very little sense. How do you think, what's the time horizon, do you think, for Moscow? How far ahead are they planning?
Well, first of all, they continue to do everything on the ground that they want to do. That's the main goal for them, yes. And the main things happening on the ground, not at the ballots. They pretend that the American elections don't matter much to Russia. And they say that the problem is not about personalities, who is the US president, but about the willingness of the sides to engage in pragmatic dialogue and to recognize Russian interests. But of course, at the same time, they're saying that the Biden administration is now kind of a hostage to the kind of war strategy that Zelensky insists on. And even if the administration realizes that this strategy is unsustainable, for them, it will be politically difficult to recognize its fallacy and seek a new approach. So, of course, they would like to see a change in the White House. And I think they're not sincere. They're saying that American elections don't matter. As for Trump, I would remind that it was under Trump that the US began a direct dialogue with Russia on Ukraine. It happened in 2017. This dialogue didn't achieve its results, but Russians were generally positive about the format itself. And I think they are not hiding, and they are not hiding this right now, that they would like to see a direct dialogue with the United States without Ukraine.
Oleg, Putin told Tucker Carlson, of all people, that he wants a deal with the United States, but presumably that's not just about Ukraine. What's your sense of what it is? What deal does Russia want to make with the Americans?
Yes, Russia keeps saying that the war will end with negotiations, not with the occupation of Kyiv or Lviv. Yes. And the main point of the public signals that Putin has been given recently is that it's impossible for Ukraine and the West to win this war, and that Ukraine and the West will have to negotiate with the current Russian government, with Putin, and they will have no other Russian interlocutor. Their idea of negotiations is structured around the Istanbul package, plus new demands that Russia might put on the table.
Can you tell audience members who might not be familiar what you mean
Yes.
by the Istanbul package?
So there are a lot of parameters. There are a lot of things about demilitarization, a lot of things about limitations on the number of troops that Ukraine can have, about the weapons that Ukraine could possess. But the key idea was the neutrality of Ukraine, that Ukraine should be like a neutral and non-aligned state, as it was before 2014. And this should be in the Ukrainian constitution. So it means, for them, it means that Ukraine would have to change its constitution and go back to a neutral status in the constitution. And this Moscow sees like the main recognition of these interests. And they're also saying that in exchange for this, Russia will be ready to give like firm guarantees of Ukrainian sovereignty. What is also interesting, yes, there are a lot of talks about the ceasefire and about the freezing on conflict. They are thinking that the West doesn't understand them. They admit that a ceasefire is possible only if the West gives firm guarantees that all military supplies to Ukraine will be stopped. Because for them, without this guarantee, any ceasefire would not make a sense. But at the same time, they're saying that as long as there are no negotiations, the war will continue, and the Russian army will continue to conduct offensive operation as long as it can. And from their side, they're waiting to see if there will be interlocutors, like on the Ukrainian side and on the Western side, who are ready to discuss with them this agenda.
So quick clarification, and I want to ask you another question, Oleg. So Istanbul is a reference to the agreement that reportedly was close to finalization back in the spring of 2022, which was the last time that there were hardcore negotiations between Ukrainians and Russians. What that was, and what you're laying out, Oleg, in terms of what the Russians want from a deal with the Americans, is still very focused on Ukraine. But do you think that's where Russia's interests end, or do you think Moscow, given the opportunity, would push for things beyond Ukraine?
No, of course, I think that if there is a deal on Ukraine, it will bind the West on the post-Soviet countries. Yes, and if there is a peace on Ukraine, it will be conditioned that the West will not interfere in other post-Soviet countries like Moldova and Georgia. Yes, because nobody will be interested in undermining this Ukrainian deal, because nobody would like to see the resumptions of war in Ukraine. And of course, Moldova is very important, for example, because Russians are blocked there right now. They don't have access to Moldova. Yes, they don't have security guarantees for Russian forces in Moldova. And of course, they would like to ask, there will be some kind of, if there are negotiations, will be some kind of negotiations on Moldova also, because Russians would like to see an access to Moldova. Yes, would like to see guarantees, security guarantees for their troops. But at the same time, they are saying, I don't know about if they are sincere, they are saying that it's possible to discuss even the reintegration of Transnistria. But again, for them, Moldova will have to be a neutral state. So it's still a neutral state right now, but I think they will ask more guarantees about Moldova's neutrality.
Thank you. I want to come back to Simon and ask, you talked a little bit about the unpopularity of decisions Ukraine would have to take, that the Ukrainian government would have to take to mobilize more people, to kind of keep the war going. But at the same time, you also say that there is a commitment on the part of Ukrainians to keep fighting. Can you talk me through some of these disconnects, talk us through some of these disconnects, and also explain a little bit of, we've seen very public fights between Zelensky and his military leadership, which he actually just swapped out his general staff chief. Does Ukraine have it together to keep this war going, or not, right? I mean, 2 years ago, the world was impressed by Ukraine's wherewithal. Ukraine was impressed by Ukraine's wherewithal. Has that evaporated, or is it there, and are the Ukrainian people being underestimated by their own government, which wouldn't be the first time?
I think the resilience that, yes, as you say, the resilience shown by Ukrainians 2 years ago really surprised everybody, including Ukrainians. And I think a lot of the hope in the air at the moment is that this can be repeated, and that Ukrainians can, in the face of losing the war, can again mobilize strengths that nobody believed they would have. The difference, of course, is really that 2 years ago, Ukrainians had an unprecedented wave of Western support that is, as we've heard throughout the talk now, is not about to be repeated. And I think this is sinking in Kyiv, but it's really hard to then come up with what does this actually mean, because negotiating with Russia, especially about territory, but also about neutrality and changing the constitution, is really out of the possibilities of Zelensky's government. It would probably be political suicide to start publicly talking about that. And it's very likely that Zelensky, as a populist, would sort of shy, as long as anyhow possible, would shy away from taking up any such measures. There is sometimes a bit of an overblown optimism, I think, in innovation. So an answer that we often get from Ukrainian politicians and also military leaders is that much of the lacks in ammunition and soldiers can be bridged with technical innovations, a couple of which we've seen, of course, in the course of this war. But many military analysts also tell us that no amount of drones can replace boots on the ground and ammunition shells forever. And I think the main reason behind this conflict between the political leadership and the military command was that the political leadership did not voice these problems frankly enough, and did not give enough space to these really unpopular truths, which led to the military asking for high numbers of newly mobilized soldiers that Zelensky was not willing to stand up for, and send this bill that the Ministry of Defense filed back for revision. And I think with this new military leadership, with General Syrski, this can be a new start with a new division of labor. Maybe this time it's very clear that Zelensky wants to do the talking and Syrski should do the fighting. What General Zaluzhny, his predecessor, has done is he's gone public with his fears and concerns, and that really undermined Zelensky's narrative of we're getting there and we were just figuring out how. So maybe this is a new start, and it's very important that this is a functioning relationship, but the constraints are not going to go away. Syrskyi will have to earn the trust of the military and also of the population. He has only half as much approval as Zaluzhny had before him. He's not quite as well known, of course, but he will have a tough time because there's no winning streak ahead like Zaluzhny had around Kyiv and with the counteroffensive in late 2022. So there's really his main task now will be to figure out exactly what kind and what soldiers he needs where, so that the government then can mobilize a smaller amount than this 500,000 that was last circulated, and for very specific tasks. And formulating these tasks is really the main task at the moment for General Syrskyi. And his first task to do that is going to be the town of Avdiivka, which is in military dynamics, it's quite similar to Bakhmut, which we've seen just about a year ago, develop in parallel. And for how he handled that, he was in command there. He's been harshly criticized for sacrificing too many soldiers for doing that. Now, a year later, he doesn't have these types of numbers. He cannot rely on sacrificing soldiers. And he also really is in a spot where he needs to earn trust. So we'll probably see a very much more economic way of using soldiers.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Audience members, we're going to chat for just a little bit longer amongst ourselves, and then I'm going to turn to some of the questions folks are sending in. So if you have questions that you would like to hear addressed, please type them into the Q&A. Before we do that, I want to come back to Alissa and ask her, Alissa, what do you expect to see coming out of Europe in the days and weeks to come? We've got the Munich Security Conference ongoing. We've got the narratives are still very much supportive of Ukraine. On the other hand, in Europe, as in the United States, lots of talk about whether populations support the war. Then there's the question of, does it matter whether wars have that much popular support? Looking at this, what do you think? Where do you think this goes for Europeans? They keep saying it's their security. They keep saying the war is existential for them too. Are they going to act like it?
Well, we're certainly seeing quite a lot of developments. Just today, you have Zelensky, right, signing a bilateral security deal with Germany and soon with France. I don't know, it might be happening as we speak over lunch. This comes in the wake of the UK being the first to announce a 10-year bilateral security deal. This is, of course, the result of, it hasn't come in a day. It's the result of decisions made at the Vilnius NATO summit in July. And, we talked about then how at the time it was just the counteroffensive was getting underway. There was a very different atmosphere. There was a certain amount of magical thinking about perhaps the amount of success that Ukraine could have once again in a renewed counteroffensive, given their success the year earlier, that Russia's forces were maybe weaker than they were. We saw how well dug in they were, just certain amount of thinking that there might be a shortcut to ending the war. But these were preparations for a long-term support. So, I think those deals are really important because they're specific, they're a sign that there's a certain amount of predictability that Ukraine can rely on. If other countries that were part of signing that agreement in July and have come on board to that agreement step up, that's also pointing to sending a message to Moscow that the support is there for the long term. And that's incredibly important in this time when, basically, as we heard from Oleg, Putin is banking on the West support collapsing. Anything that can be done to show that there is still a consensus that's supporting Ukraine and, doing and that countries will continue to do so is very important in perhaps changing the Kremlin calculus. And also, it's maybe a sign that there's a beginning to be more of a joint strategy. There was a lot of blame back and forth between among Kyiv's backers, but also between Kyiv and its backers about tactics, about whether the right strategy, about whether basically the counteroffensive failed because Ukraine wasn't doing the right thing, or the West didn't provide enough weapons in time, just a lot of that. And if you can issue that and kind of move forward on a strategy, that's really important. So, I mean, Europe has passed this financial aid package of the 50 billion over 4 years. That's really important economic support for Ukraine. There's been announcements now of a new coalition to help with drones in the last days. There's a whole patchwork of bilateral pledges and sort of coalition pledges. Whether that amounts to enough in the long term really will depend on whether the defense industry gets the type of contracts, gets the type of investment, moves fast enough to ramp up to meet those pledges. But I think it's important to just, go back to what we've been talking about this whole time, 40 minutes or so, that, while these long-term pledges and signs of commitments are really important, there's some immediate urgent decisions that need to be made to help Ukraine get through the year ahead, to give them the artillery they need to hold the line, to beef up air defenses so that they can continue to shoot down Russian missiles, maybe to give them the wherewithal to continue to put pressure on Russia and the Black Sea, as they've done with these successful strikes on Russian warships. And those are decisions in the coming months, not a 10-year security arrangement that is promising, but a more long-term thing.
Thanks. So Sarah, how about in Washington? As you said, Congress has gone on leave, and then they're going to come back and try to keep the government open. But it is still the job of the executive branch to define and implement foreign policy. What do you think they're going to try to do?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration has been very clear about its support for Ukraine. I don't think that is going to weaken anytime soon. They're going to continue to push Congress to pass more funding. And I think that they will look at the options available to them. Again, some of the things that they could do, like security cooperation through the Defense Department, or provide certain types of border security funding through the State Department, or even authorize third-party transfers of equipment that the U.S. has provided to, for example, European countries, and authorize those to be transferred to Ukraine. It's all measures they can take. They're just not going to be sufficient. There is a lot of discussion about seizing frozen Russian assets, though there are still many obstacles to that. And seizing those assets to then use that money to help Ukraine. Most of those obstacles are legal and political, with allies in Europe. Definitely concerns about the ways in which financial institutions might respond to that. And then the president's cabinet members have expressed concerns about legal authorities. And so Congress has been working on a bill called the Repo Act that would give the president certain authorities to be able to do that. But again, we're hearing from officials that's not going to be sufficient to meet the moment and provide Ukraine with what it needs right now. And so I think the Biden administration has a really difficult way ahead. And it has a difficult way ahead because it cannot really argue in a logical way with the extreme minority that is controlling the House on why this is important, given that they are very much directed by President Trump, and also very much focused on the southern border. Now, that is an intractable issue that hasn't been fixed for decades. And so to tie it to Ukraine seems like, it's an impossible hurdle to overcome, to fix the border before the US can provide assistance to Ukraine. And so I think they will continue they will continue what they've been doing, which is pushing for assistance. It's just going to be really difficult. And I think the president will continue to insist that the transatlantic alliance is critical to US security. It will just be, I think, continually harder to convey that to the American electorate, the more that they're hearing disinformation from former President Trump on the campaign trail.
Okay, wow, thank you. I have to say, I have a bit of a flashback to December, January, early February of 2022, when we were all pretty confident that everything was bleak, that Russia was going to succeed, if not as rapidly as it thought, and not as painlessly as it thought, but it was going to succeed in Ukraine. And Europe was going to settle into an armed fortress that was, with US support, trying to deter Russia from attacks on NATO and EU member states. So not quite a flashback, right? It's shifted a bit, but the expectations of Russian victory do seem to be back, and with a vengeance, though I suppose the response in the West, at least narratively, is different, even if walking the talk has proven much more difficult. I want to go to some of the questions we have received. We've gotten a good number, and so I'm going to apologize in advance for the fact that we will not get to all of them. I'm going to start. I'm going to address this one to Simone. There's a question from Pierluigi Signor asking about the political mood to the extent that we know it in occupied territories. Who are they supporting? How do they feel about being occupied? Can we tell?
It's really hard to tell. There are people doing research on the mood in occupied territories, and what they're finding is that there's quite a bit of movement of people leaving because they don't like it, and other people moving in, and also moving up socially if they arrange themselves with the occupying forces, and that can be a convincing way for the Russians to get the local population that remains onto their side. One way the research on this is being done is looking at corporate registers from Russia and how properties and flats do change hands. And what we're seeing there is that in the DNR, LNR areas, and also where it expanded to, like Mariupol, for example, which is a sort of a new part of DNR, that these established networks that existed in Donetsk and Luhansk before the invasion are taken over, but that in Zaporizhia and Kherson, where there is no established network and people are just occupied since 2022 now, that it's actually locals filling in these positions of and growing richer as they collaborate with the occupiers. So there are people that are making arrangements. There's little political activity that is not controlled by Moscow, and therefore it's really hard to know what the mood is of the people who are not in the public area, but I think the people that are still there now, they are making their arrangements, and they're probably also not at the moment thinking very much about what is going to happen to them if the Ukrainians are coming back, right? The Ukrainians also installed laws that would punish people that collaborate now with the occupiers, with the idea to deter people like that, but that is probably quite a distant fear for people in occupied areas now, and probably their main concern is to make their amends with the occupiers.
Thanks. So this is a question from Joost van der Meer about European security, and I'm going to direct it initially to Alissa, but I might ask some follow-up questions of Sarah and Oleg. And Joost is asking whether European security might not be advanced if the Europeans did walk their talk that Ukraine must not lose and Russia must not win, and remove some of the limitations they have previously imposed on the sorts of weapons being provided to Ukraine. What do you think, Alissa?
I mean, look, it's a very good question, because I personally think it's a very important debate to be had still. You know, there is the the question of, are the fears of escalation that we saw in the first months after Russia's full-scale invasion still as relevant as they used to be now that we've had more time to analyze sort of the patterns of Russian behavior, the ways in which it's escalated, and the ways in which all parties have sort of not shown a certain amount of restraint. I don't want to say that Russia's shown restraint when it's, pummeling Ukraine with missiles. So, but, some people and some military analysts are asking whether, one of the things that the West can do is not only provide more than, say, a handful of ATACMS that the US provided in June, but more long-range missiles and take away the limitations on striking Russian territory. That this is tying Ukraine's hands. These are important questions to debate and to discuss. I don't have an answer. I'm going to throw the question back at you, Olga, because we talk about it a lot within the team, these kinds of issues. So, the question is there more that Europe can do? Certainly. How much should it do, and how much is it prepared to do or able? These things are being figured out, and I think everything we've heard on the call shows why, both leaders in Europe are waking up to the fact that they need to do this with more urgency and trying to figure out how much they can actually accomplish. Whether there's popular support, sorry, just to get to the last bit of your question, for supporting Ukraine. Everybody worries about their own pocketbooks, their own high energy prices, about the cost of living, about inflation. For the moment, we have not seen that undermine rather widespread support, especially in countries like the United Kingdom, where I'm sitting, for supporting Ukraine, or others. But no doubt, in European parliamentary elections, we will see a surge of some parties, making the most of criticism of existing governments, be it on the far right, or even maybe parties on the far left, because of discontent over these issues. But I would say that Russia and Ukraine are not central, as they have been in the United States, to debates, political debates in that way.
Thank you. I'll weigh in, but I want to bring Sarah and Ali again before I do. Sarah, do you think there's a desire in Washington to remove some of the limits that have been in place before? Or is this just a ridiculous question to ask, given that would require supplementals? So we just get the ammunition moving that we are able to send before we talk about anything else.
Yeah, I think, obviously, first they're going to need appropriations, an increase in the presidential drawdown, money to replenish stocks, et cetera. But we've seen over the course of the war, the internal discussions within the executive branch lead to them being more comfortable with certain types of equipment at the beginning of the war that they wouldn't have sent, that they are, that they have been open to sending and have sent to Ukraine, like ATACMS. And so there are discussions about every time there's a new piece of equipment that the US would send is, would we be comfortable if this were in the hands of the Russians, right? Because that's what happens on the battlefield. Is this technology that we don't want to them to reverse engineer, for example? Is this going to escalate the war? That's a big question. And so they've I think passed their own red lines throughout this conflict, and so there's a possibility there. But obviously, they need the ability to be able to have those conversations before they can get to that. And I think that they've really prioritized Ukrainian security and advancements on the battlefield, and really tried to balance that well with mitigating risk of escalation. So I wouldn't say it's off the table, but they obviously need Congress to act. Yeah.
Thanks. And to Oleg, how much do the Russians care at this point? What are they going to do if by some miracle, not only does the money come through, but weapons start getting sent that haven't been sent before and with fewer restrictions, is that going to freak the Russians out? Is it going to make them stand down? Is it going to make them escalate further? What happens?
It's a good questions, but I think they will not do anything, because if you can't do anything, you can't do anything. Yes, you can't respond. Yes, technically, Ukrainians shut down a Russian plan using the Western missiles. Yes, they didn't answer. So I think this war is a war of mass mobilization, mobilization of resources, and mobilization of firepower. So it will not be decided by unique kind of weapon. Yes, it will be decided by how each side could mobilize, how many resources, how much firepower, how much manpower. So not the unique kind of weapons. I don't think that Russia has good responses for such escalation, but we should ask ourselves if it changes the situation on the ground or not, how it would influence. Because, for example, Ukraine now has an advantage in the Black Sea, yes, but does it change the situation near Avdiivka? No.
Thanks, Oleg. And I guess for my part, what I would say echoes somewhat all of my fellow panelists have said. Look, I think that the slow ramp up was the right policy decision. I think that if Western states had poured in at the beginning what they ended up pouring in, not that they were able to, right? So even then it would have been a fraction of it, but if they had poured in a lot more, I think the escalation risks early on would have been very, very high. I think at this point we have precedent and decisions made by Moscow that make the escalation much less likely. And that also kind of answers a little bit a question that we've got from Waldemar Ingdahl asking about the risk of weapons of mass destruction. I think that risk is now low. That doesn't mean it was always low, right? It is a product of how this conflict has evolved, the choices Russia has already made, precedents that have been set. But I also think that we've got to get the ammunition to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have got to get the people into the force before this is anything other than an academic conversation. I would like to turn now to a question posed by Ian Bond from the Center for European Reform. This question, I think, goes to Simon. Ian is asking if the political parties in Ukraine are pressing to hold elections. You sometimes get these debates saying that how much of a democracy is Ukraine if it can't hold elections. Of course, holding elections in the midst of a war is difficult for a wide range of reasons. What do Ukrainians think about this?
So the last surveys show quite strong popular support for not holding elections at the moment, and also cross-party consensus. There's a memorandum of understanding from November between the major political parties that rules out elections as long as martial law is in place. And the reasons for that are really quite convincing. It's technically really hard to let refugees vote, to let people in occupied areas vote, to let people who are serving in the army run for office and vote, and also to reach internally displaced people whose registration is not always clear. So these are all big problems and technical problems need to be addressed technically. And then there's the question of how do you deal with occupied territories? That is a constitutional question that Ukraine has answered in part by leaving some seats vacant from the occupied territories in the last elections after 2014. But now this is a much bigger territory, and it would be a really hard political question to answer what to do, how to represent these areas. So while this is undermining political representation clearly and weakening the mandate both of the president and the parliament, there isn't a lot of immediate calls for elections. But I think what will grow in 2024 is a call of the government actively addressing these issues and finding ways to address them, because the reality of a long conflict is sinking in. And I think another thing that we're going to see is sort of bridging measures that, especially locally, are going to be more important. How local governments can consult with their populations about local policies without having elections. This can be petitions, town halls, and so forth. There is the basis for these instruments is usually laid, but they can be extended and strengthened, these instruments. And what you really don't get much here is a sense of that Ukrainian democracy is on the line. Recently heard the metaphor of Ukrainian democracy being like grass beneath the pavement, that you can pave over it, but it will sprout through even the thickest pavement coming back when these restrictions are lifted. We don't know when this is going to be, but I think Ukrainian civil society has been quite resilient throughout this and is still resilient. So the pressure of thinking of how to resolve and address the constitutional questions and the technical questions around these are going to be louder. But at the moment, there's no sense of desperation that Ukrainian democracy is on the way out.
Thanks, Simon. So I've got a question I'm actually going to just throw out and see which of you all wants to take a crack at it. I think it's a very difficult one to answer, but I'll ask it. It's coming from Maximilian Frundlieb, who is asking what our expectations are for a timeline on potential negotiations or ceasefire. Does it have something to do with the US elections? Sometime in 2025, I'll add to that Russian elections. Do we have any thoughts? I mean, my own take would be that it depends on how the battlefield goes, which of course depends on whether the weapons start flowing again. That if Ukraine finds itself on the run, it might be forced into a negotiation. Conversely, if it can turn things around, the Russians might be more interested in negotiation. But I'm curious if any of my colleagues have anything to add to that fairly simplistic answer to the question. Anyone? Alissa, yeah.
Give a shot saying what I think, speaking for everybody, I there's a certain amount of literature out there, which, you probably know better than me as with your more academic background from my journalism background, that this was going to be, once the conflict has lasted for a certain amount of time, it's bound to last for quite a number of years ahead. And, the question being whether, neither side seeing a readiness or a feeling that they have expended and exhausted all of their resources is currently the case, and doesn't look like it will be the case in anytime soon. And also just, from a Ukrainian perspective, we've seen one super successful, I guess, counteroffensive, the big overly hyped counteroffensive of this past year. But in a war, that's not in a long war. That's just the beginning. I'm afraid to say, and I don't know that even if maybe Simon can speak to this, but even if there is this slow and painfully unraveling of Western assistance that we're seeing because of the gridlock in Washington, it's not going to be an immediate halt, and there's nothing that's going to stop Ukraine from, to immediately surrender. So we're likely to see fighting going on even for a long time, even if it's a slow and painful loss of at the front lines of strength, of relative strength at the front lines, I guess. And you need all these things to have negotiations, as you said, right?
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in? Okay, if not, we'll go to another question. I'm going to apologize to questioners who are asking about the impact of the death of Alexei Navalny. I don't think, having discussed this a little bit with my colleagues beforehand, I don't think we have the predictive powers on this one. So I think we're gonna punt. I am going to turn to Oleg with a question from Brooke Demogreader, who is asking whether the Western concerns about Russia attacking EU and NATO member states in the future, kind of whether in Russia that has any resonance? How are these conversations perceived in Russia? And Oleg, what's your own take on those risks?
They are saying that these conversations are nonsense. Yes, they are not. They don't have interests in the Baltics. They don't have interests in NATO countries. They let Baltics join NATO and the EU. Yes, so their opinion about this never changed. And from my opinion, I think it's very difficult to imagine any attack from Russia on a NATO country. Yes, maybe Russia has a lot of people on the ground, but it doesn't have a lot of modern weapons. Yes, we've seen that the Russian air power is quite mediocre. Yes, they have problems with missiles, with satellites, with everything. So they have a clear disadvantage in terms of modern weapons. Yes, they have a mass army, but what is the goal of their attack in NATO? Suwalki corridor, but they had an agreement with the EU on the transit to Kaliningrad. Yes, and everybody complied with this agreement. We didn't have any problems on that. So I don't see any sense for it right now. Yes, of course, if we have a different situation in Ukraine, if they have like a peace deal on Russia's terms, the situation could change and the perception from both sides could change. But now I don't see any possibility for this. So I would say that Russians, their thinking could be like weird, but they are not thinking about suicide. That's clear.
But if they win in Ukraine, all bets are off, or?
I mean, what does it mean to win at Ukraine? If we believe what they're talking about, if they believe that the main point is about geopolitical things like neutrality, so it means that Ukraine will continue to exist, yes, and it will be a neutral country for them. And even if Ukraine is a neutral country, it still has a lot of population. Yes, it still has a mobilization resource. And if Russia attacks a NATO country, how would Ukraine behave in this situation? Yes, so I mean, if they have, even if we try to imagine that they have a peace on their terms, so they should be also interested in keeping this situation, yes, in preserving this situation. And it means that they understand that they will not have interests to wage a war against NATO, which looks a nonsense for them right now.
Thank you. I think this question has been partially answered, but I think it's worth unpacking a little bit more. The question comes from Dr. Richard Lobin at the Naval War College, asking whether more drones and other specific weaponry wouldn't, I mean, this isn't like, is there a magic weapon that will make all the difference? But the question is whether drones, javelins, storm shadows could somehow make up for the artillery gaps, so the ammunition gaps. And my sense is not so much. And also you still have these same problems of you need the money and you need the stuff to flow. But I'm wondering if any of my colleagues would also like to weigh in on that one.
I mean,
Alissa? Yeah.
just to not state the obvious, I mean, I think it depends on the strategy that is laid out for the year ahead, right? There's one thing about, sort of defense and the front lines, and we all know that unlike World War II or other wars, the drones and the surveillance capacity of both sides is one of the reasons that we see it it being very difficult for there to be fast movement by either party on an offensive. But in terms, and that, Oleg said there's no magic bullet of a weapon, but for example, in the UK's 10-year bilateral security deal with Ukraine, they focused on the Black Sea. They tried to focus on areas in which Ukraine appears to have had a certain amount of success in recent months, in spite of the disappointment of the counteroffensive, where they have been able to push the Russian war ships and fleet out of the west of the Black Sea and continue to export grain. And so I think, the question being when Zaluzhny and maybe now Syrskyi and Zelensky and others come up with this list of new technologies and weapons that they would like, you can build on this, Olga, but I would think the question is, what is the strategy in the year ahead, hand in hand with partners? And if you just get a few of these things, it's going to make a difference. You need to have a sustained amount of long-range missiles to have a strategy, not just a couple with a couple of strikes. And the second being, once you introduce these into the battlefield, my sense from military analysts that I've been reading and speaking to is that Russia has been very good at adapting as well. So, if Ukraine innovates, but then Russia comes and takes those same innovations and deploys them on the battlefield, then how does that work out?
Thanks. Anybody else want to jump in on this one? Sorry about that. I first asked if anybody else wanted to jump in on this, but I guess not. Speak now, forever hold your peace. I've got a question, which I think I'm going to make the last one. And it's another one that I'm not sure there's a good, easy answer to. And it comes from Ramsey in Brussels, who is asking how long Ukraine can hold out if the US stops support, if this is kind of all that happens, is what is already in the pipeline. And, my short answer is, look, shifting to defense is going to be less ammunition. It's going to suck up less ammunition. There's a word that just flew out of my head. But it's not eternal, right? It's just, it just means that you need less in the immediate period, but you still need it over time, and it's still an ammunition-heavy war. It's still an artillery-heavy war. And then I think, as Alissa has said, as Simone has said, a lot depends on the actual strategy and the specifics of it. As Simone has said, you're already seeing the Ukrainians report that they're trying to make up for gaps. Now, some of those gaps are personnel gaps, and there are things Ukraine could do. As Simone says, they're unpopular. But honestly, if your choice is between losing the war or being unpopular, I don't know. I kind of suspect that a little bit of unpopularity might be worth the risk, and maybe you wouldn't even be that unpopular if it's actually necessary. But I don't know. I think I'm actually interested in what Sarah has to say on this, what she has heard in her conversations with US officials on this point.
Yeah, it's pretty grim what we have been hearing from US officials, that without air defense, interceptors, the things that we've been discussing on this call, and ammunition, so keeping bombs out of the sky and advancing on the front lines, without that weaponry and without that artillery and ammunition, Ukraine forces that are already making difficult priority decisions about what to defend, where to advance, will have to prioritize even more. And US officials don't think they have that long. It's already a really difficult picture on the ground. And so if they continue if the amount that has been amount of equipment and ammunition that's been provided to Ukraine continues to dwindle, you can just imagine that they continue to lose ground, and they continue to not be able to defend certain towns and cities and areas that they've been defending. And so they think the assessments we've heard was a matter of months until it gets much worse. And that's why there's so much pressure to act quickly to be able to send more to Ukraine. And you know, Congress dragging its feet it's obviously very unhelpful, because even once Congress passes the funding, it takes a while to send equipment. And it can, you know, days, weeks, if not months. And so time is of the essence. And if the US wants to avoid a really bad scenario by summer, is what officials said, then they need more money now.
Thank you, Sarah. On that note, I think we're going to close this up. I want to ask you to join me in thanking the speakers, who I think were tremendous, and also the guests who attended the call and posed such difficult and valuable questions. My apologies that we were not able to get to all of them, or answer even some of the ones that we did get to in full, because they're hard questions. The recording of this event will be available very shortly on our YouTube channel, and also at www.crisisgroup.org/event-recordings if you want to share with your friends and family, or watch it over and over and over again. So with that, thanks to everybody for joining us. And I think look forward to more of these conversations. We'll see where we go from here.